The Icarus Mind. Written by J. Royce Lockwood. Illustrated by Artificial Ink. Music by Roman Senek. Chapter 2. Driftless. Michael, 30 years later. Michael Quinn leaned into a banking turn and the hillsides parted, yielding to the gently sloping valley of the Driftless reservation below. He tightened his grip on the handlebars, delighting in the calming flush of bracing wind as the landscape fled past him. Trees and tarmac wove an impressionistic tapestry, a mesmerizing blur whose predictable motion gave rise to a contrary stillness in his mind. The route was familiar. Michael had made this 3-mile sojourn nearly every day for the past 6 months, ever since taking up residence in a remote cabin tucked away on an unused corner of his grandmother's property. There he found some respite from the carnival of sensory impulses which drove him to distraction. Still, he could not completely ignore the whispers, and his thoughts would sometimes linger on the faint memory of a premonition, rumors of a forgotten lineage. But that voice was silent now, drowned in the satisfying rumble of the motor, and the visions were subdued as he trained his perception on the rolling terrain stretching out before him. Michael loved this place. The reservation had been established in an isolated quadrant of the Driftless region, a landlocked sector of highland untouched by the glaciers of preceding ice ages. The incision of the upper Mississippi River and its tributaries into the bedrock, and the absence of glacial drift, produced a rugged landscape encompassing more than 24,000 square miles across portions of Illinois, Iowa, Minnesota, and Wisconsin. The terrain, though beautiful and more dramatic than the surrounding savannas, was inhospitable to the row cropping and industrial farming techniques which fed the ever-growing cities where 95% of the population now dwelled. The remaining 5%, nearly 20 million people, lived in varying degrees of technological development across the country, a substantial minority of dissenters whose existence was tolerated by the government as the lesser of two evils. This was the grand compromise that ended the riots which brought the nation to the brink of civil war nearly 2 decades before. These dissidents refused to undergo the now standard biometric registration process and would not allow themselves to be integrated with the network of databases which had been established to facilitate new security protocols and efficiency measures. The process of being chipped, as it had come to be known, was a particularly contentious initiative, which had gained traction under considerable pressure from the numerous seats of authority. Michael had never been chipped. He was a transplant delivered to the Driftless community as an infant. He had, in fact, come and gone twice in his life, having left the reservation again when he was 18, establishing a life in Chicago for nearly 10 years before returning to Driftless on his 28th birthday. It was common for the youth of these intentional communities to leave temporarily on an experimental sojourn, a Rumspringa of sorts. This indulgence was meant to encourage as many young people as possible to repatriate back into civilization. The majority, nearly 80%, returned to their reservations within a year. Still, a significant minority chose to assimilate and remained in the modern world. And for Michael, this was an auspicious day. Today the ceremony would be held. Today he would decide. He sped down a small lane buttressed by columns of maple and alder trees, whose leaves were now turning with the first chill breath of autumn. Gravel crunched beneath his tires as Michael pulled into a broad, level driveway. This particular parcel of land was owned and managed by Michael's grandmother, Tara Quinn, a spry woman of 75 years who had overseen the implementation of the original site design nearly 4 decades ago. It was early, but the yard was alive. Tara's neighbors and friends had begun to arrive, some in gas-powered cars and trucks, others by foot, and more than a few on horseback. Behind the house, on a flat section of grass, several guests were busy setting up tables. Others attended to overexcited children while sharing news and stories from their farms and homesteads. Out from the covered porch and into this burgeoning maelstrom stepped Tara Quinn.
Michael, there you are.
She approached and took Michael's hand, leading him back towards the house.
Have you eaten?
On her way inside, Tara plucked a few sprigs of dill from the herb garden and collected 4 freshly laid eggs from the chicken coop. Like most of the structures on the reservation, Tara's home was designed to be an integral part of its surroundings. The kitchen garden stood within several strides of the doorway, tools and facilities organized for maximum efficiency. It lay downhill from a water source, south-facing with good passive heating capacity. Such aesthetic efficiency attended every aspect of the homestead. Upon entering, Tara sparked the kindling and they heard the satisfying swoosh as a draft of air drew the flame inward towards the belly of the rocket stove and up through the convolution of baffles contained in the masonry of the walls. Hence the act of cooking breakfast warmed the small home with incredible efficiency. Function stacking, it was called.
You look like you could use a pick-me-up. Here, drink this.
Tara placed a cup of brown liquid on the table next to Michael's plate.
It's a mild nootropic. It'll aid in the release of dopamine and improve concentration and cognitive function.
Okay. Michael inspected the suspicious liquid. What is it?
Coffee.
Tara smiled.
Come with me. I have something for you.
Tara led him through the kitchen towards her bedroom at the back of the house, where she retrieved a small urn from a bureau drawer.
I want you to have this.
She presented the vessel to him with uncharacteristic formality.
I was thinking you could spread your father's ashes at the top of the hill. Maybe tomorrow morning after your period of reflection.
Michael's chest constricted. Sure, Grandma. I would be honored. He took the receptacle from her. I wish I could have known him. Michael was an orphan, the only child of a mixed-race couple. His father had been a native of this region, but his mother was ethnically Chinese from the island nation of Singapore. Thus, Michael's heritage was expressed by his round, hazel eyes, dark flaxen hair, and fair skin. He was often mistaken for Native American by newcomers, but longtime residents of the reservation knew of his unusual provenance and looked upon him with a mixture of sympathy and wonder. His arrival at Driftless had been something of a scandal. Michael was delivered in the dead of night as an infant, not by his mother or father, but by an outsider who had identified himself only by his surname, Lim. At the time, there were no neighbors to overhear Lim's cryptic account of the sudden death of Michael's parents, or comfort Tara as he delivered the cremated remains of her son. The only information the stranger would provide was that Michael's father had suffered a stroke while driving and lost control of the vehicle, killing both himself and Michael's mother instantly. The mysterious messenger left as abruptly as he had arrived, and that was the last Tara heard from him. Tara eventually came to terms with the fact that she would never know exactly what happened. Tara mourned her son and strove to build a life for Michael within the emerging community that would become the Driftless Reservation. A week later, Simon Quinn's badly damaged motorcycle was delivered, the last remaining artifact of her son, and apart from his cremated remains, Michael's sole physical connection to his father.
You remind me so much of him.
Tara placed a hand on Michael's cheek.
And he would have been so proud of you.
Michael embraced his grandmother and they paused, allowing the emotion to swell and retreat. Then Tara wiped her eyes and exhaled sharply, rousting the mournful sentiment from her body.
Let's go. There's lots to do.
She patted him on the side of his shoulder and headed back down the hallway. Michael stood alone in the darkened corridor, regarding the urn in silence before finally placing it carefully in his backpack and following his grandmother to the kitchen. Michael finished his simple repast and stepped outside to enjoy the fresh morning air. The sun was only now beginning to peek cautiously over the easterly hilltops, but the sky was bright, a cloud-dappled sheet of pale blue. As Michael's mind began to wander, a suspiciously modern-looking sedan pulled into Tara's driveway. The driver's side door opened, and out leapt a maelstrom of white fur. Michael sucked in his breath. There was only one person he knew with a Siberian husky.
Selena!
Tara strode to the front of the yard. a young woman emerged from the car. She wore dark, close-fit blue jeans and a black sweater. Her dark hair was drawn into a low ponytail.
Snowy, come.
She called after her willful pet. The dog ignored her cries and bounded towards Michael, jumping on him affectionately, nearly knocking him over. Tara wrapped the woman in a warm embrace.
Selena, I didn't expect to see you today. I thought you were in Minneapolis now. How are you?
I didn't expect to see you either. Michael regained his balance and approached. Are you here for me?
I hadn't planned to come, but I have some news.
Selena flashed a glance at Michael, but did not allow her eyes to linger.
We've been picking up a lot of chatter lately about a new bill that's being drafted in the state senate that will revoke the Driftless charter. It doesn't have enough votes yet, but it seems to have legs.
Tara laughed.
Oh dear, is that why you drove all the way out here to tell us that? Selena, my dear, there have been rumors like that floating around for years. Nothing ever comes of it. And besides,
Tara placed a hand on Selena's arm.
It's a federal matter. The state legislature can't dictate to us.
But that's how it always starts, isn't it? Said Michael. They initiate in the states and then they elevate, challenge in the courts and overturn precedent. I'd be surprised if we didn't see similar actions in other state houses. It's about time we did something. Fight back.
Fight back against whom?
Tara held Michael's gaze.
Against what? A rumor? I admire your passion, young man, but take it from one who's been around a while. This is just more of the same. This political theater is directed at a particular local audience and won't go anywhere or amount to anything.
But Tara, I really do need to speak with you and the other members of the council.
Yes, there will be plenty of time for that.
Tara led them deeper into the yard.
Right now, I have a lot of work to do. Tell you what, why don't you two head up to the keynote at the top of the hill? I want to know how the overflow sills are doing after yesterday's rain.
Tara turned and walked back towards her porch, leaving a vacuum of silence in her wake. Michael scratched the back of his head. Well, I guess we have our marching orders. Selena exhaled audibly.
Guess so.
Michael led them up the driveway towards the foot of a forgiving incline at the far end of the yard. So, what's all this about revoking our charter? Is that really the only reason she was here? A warning about some vague threat to Driftless?
It was all over Empyrean.
Selena fixed her gaze on the path in front of her.
The topic blew up for about 6 hours, and then they scrubbed it from the network. That's why we think it's legit.
Empyrean? How can you trust anything that comes out of that fantasy world? Michael shook his head. Anyway, it doesn't make sense. We're no threat to anyone here. Why would they start caring about us now?
You don't see what I see.
Selena stopped, placing a hand on Michael's shoulder.
Empyrean is where the real battle is being fought. The amount of surveillance and attempted encroachment on the reservation has been increasing.
Michael smiled. I can't believe you left Driftless to become a hacker.
I'm not a hacker.
Selena crossed her arms.
I'm a ranger. I love Driftless as much as you do. But you know, this whole thing would collapse without sympathetic people on the inside looking out for you. What little privacy is left here is due to us.
Gravel gave way to dirt, and they followed a well-trodden path ascending a series of gentle switchbacks until they reached a level place with a commanding view of the surrounding area. From this vantage point, Michael spied his own small cabin, couched in a fold of a complimentary hillside half a mile distant as the crow flies. As he scanned the horizon, Michael's eye was drawn to a small black dot floating high above the canopy. Selena, check that out, Michael pointed. What is that? Then instantly and with increasing intensity, Michael felt a wave of nausea grow in the pit of his stomach. The shape of trees and rolling hills vibrated gently, their borders bleeding into one another. Above them, the sky seemed almost to draw breath as the apparition moved steadily across their field of view. Though he could not be certain, it looked to Michael as though the flying object hovered above his cabin, pausing briefly before slipping behind a wispy veil of clouds. The physical sensation passed as well, but the seed of dreams, long dormant and deeply planted, began to stir.
What was that, an eagle?
Selena's words pierced through Michael's distraction.
You think old Spitz is out hawking again?
I don't know. Michael shook his head. I'm sorry, I'm just a little dizzy.
Do you need to sit down?
No, I'm all right. But man, that hasn't happened in a long time. Not so strongly, anyway.
You mean the visions?
Selena raised an eyebrow.
I could never get over how you're able to see sounds.
Selena was one of the few people who knew about Michael's condition. A doctor had once diagnosed it as synesthesia, but his symptoms were not strictly indicative of that disorder. Michael was indeed able to see sounds as colors. The auditory intimations of music and voice and the natural world would at times present themselves as faint outlines of repeating geometric patterns, receding in fractalized infinitude. But that particular feature of his condition was tolerable, even enjoyable. The disconcerting element of his particular mental aberration was a rare but potent amplification of his sensory experience, a writhing turbulence in which the entire visual landscape seemed to pulse or ripple, as if the entire veil of perception might be torn away completely. Michael called it the glimmering, and it frightened him. Sometimes it's visual like that, yes, but other times I'll get a strange feeling about something, I'll have an intuition and just know something, almost like an idea is just planted in my head. Anyway, it hasn't happened to any real degree since I left Chicago. Thought I had it under control. By now, the dizziness had abated, and Michael continued walking up the hill.
How did you end up there in the first place?
Selena kept pace beside him.
Most of us who left went to Minneapolis.
Bill Jameson. Michael stopped walking. An old friend of my father. I thought when I started working for Bill that I'd learn more about my parents. Well, my dad at least. They knew each other once, but that was only for a couple years in college. Bill never even met my mother. He didn't end up being much help. Selena followed Michael on towards a loftier perch. Here, the natural folds in the earth converged and creased again, directing the flow of water over the landscape. This was the key point, the reference from which all of the swales and ditches, dams and ponds were derived. Water's flowing good. Michael cast his gaze around the site. Looks like the berms are holding up fine. The place was alive with the chirping of birds, the buzzing of insects, and the occasional flash of a squirrel's tail as it flitted up the trunk of a tree. One could easily mistake this farm for a wilderness, save for the fact that nearly every form of vegetation bore some edible fruit or beneficial fiber or leaf.
You were there for quite a while.
Selena kept pace.
Almost a full probationary period. We thought you would stay abroad for good. I can't believe you spent 10 years selling insurance.
I wasn't selling insurance, Michael smirked. She knew that. I helped investigate claims. First time my condition was of any use to me. Sometimes I get a funny feeling about a case or a file, dig into it a little further. A lot of times it would turn out that a claim is fraudulent or not what it appeared to be. I saved the firm a lot of money.
So what made you finally decide to leave?
I think the place was just too cynical for me. Michael began walking again, leading them back down toward the first row of fruit trees. The last case I was working on, for example, I was investigating the disappearance of this guy, Tyrant of Thebes. He was a minecaster on Empyrean. You might have heard of him. Selena cocked her head.
You're in contact with him?
Michael nodded. So you have heard of him? Selena's eyes narrowed.
Sure. But I thought the Tyrant of Thebes was expelled from Empyrean.
There were lots of rumors, Michael shrugged. The party line was that it was just some publicity stunt by Empyrean itself, or maybe a way to flesh out resistance elements, but none of it felt right to me, so I started looking into it.
That's a dangerous business.
Selena pursed her lips. Michael nodded. Anyway, I didn't have much to go on. There was a lot of chatter on some of the Empyrean speakeasies, but it was pretty useless. I tell you, this guy had quite a little following, too.
So, did you find him? Find out what happened, I mean?
Nah, Michael chuckled. There was this one person on one of the Empyrean forums who direct messaged me claiming to have some information on his whereabouts. I replied with a private email address, but the next day, some guy who said he was from the FBI was in the office talking to Bill. We were given a very clear warning to stand down. Bill was pretty pissed. He didn't even know I was looking into it.
You're lucky that's all they did.
Selena shook her head. Michael took a deep breath. No tolerance for dissent these days. Anyway, this last time was just the final straw, so I decided to come back home.
I see.
Selena fixed her gaze on the ground.
So, what's the plan then?
What does she want me to say? Did she approve of his choice? Did she want him to join her in the city? Michael scanned the pastoral surroundings, inhaling the fresh autumn air. Before them lay the many small farms of Driftless, 20,000 acres of undulating, terraformed landscape, alternating ribbons of earthen mounds and irrigation ditches etched with precision into the natural contour of the crumpled topography. Through careful observation over many decades, the designers had learned to harness the earthly energies of sun, wind, and rain, giving rise to an ever-increasing fertility and natural abundance. He marveled anew at how beautiful it was when people worked with nature rather than against it. All I've ever wanted was to live and work here in Driftless. Even while I was abroad, I thought about coming home, but it felt somehow unearned. Selena bowed her head slightly.
I can't tell you what you should do, but I can tell you that we all have different gifts, and yours is unique. You can be of real service to Driftless, even abroad.
My gift? Michael shook his head. Oh, well, I never really thought of it as a gift.
Don't kid yourself. These visions, this glimmering, whatever you want to call it, your intuition, it's something which none of us understand. And I don't think you'll understand its meaning hiding up here on a hilltop in Driftless.
You see this? Michael waved his arm at a collection of plants circling a large tree. This is a plant guild, a community of mutually supportive plant species. My grandmother selected the plants for this guild. Some of these plants produce food for us, some are food for animals, some repel pests, others provide shade or structure for the vines to climb. It's like a little village, you see, with each plant providing a service to the others. Michael kneeled at the foot of the tree and dug into the soil with his fingers, churning up a handful of earth. On the ground surrounding the trunk, a colony of white mushrooms had emerged. Look here, he pointed to a network of thin white strands woven throughout the clump of earth. Fungal mycelia. 1 cubic inch of soil contains up to 8 miles of this stuff. They spread out all over the place to find nutrients, detect pathogens, relay information on the condition of the soil, and they share all of that information with the rest of the network. Clever little guys, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, it's like a little communication hub.
Selena stooped down next to Michael. Little, and not so little. Michael placed the handful of earth back on the ground. Did you know that the largest living organism in the world is a honey mushroom network up in Oregon? A mycelial mat, 2,400 acres in size, and more than 2,000 years old, they say. Can you imagine the number of connections those little mycelia would have?
Why are you telling me all this? Fungils and fungal mycelia? What are you driving at?
Michael rose and dusted the soil from his hands. The point is that there's more than one way to plug into a network, and there's more than one way to serve.